Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Nope. Very much welcome to this official side event for the COP27 with the title of a Just Mobility Transition, Perspectives of Inclusive Transport, including Aviation. It's very pleased to see you all here. My name is Jari KAUPPILA. I'm head of the Secretary General's Office at the International Transport Forum. We are an intergovernmental organization working for ministers of transport for 64 countries around the world. I'm very delighted to have this first panel, what we call policy panel, with representatives here today. Let me very, very quickly run through our panel members. We have Her Excellency Amani ABOU-ZEID from African Union Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy. She is arriving. We are very pleased to have the Head of Transport and Mobility here with us in the meanwhile. We are very pleased to have Andrew WISHNIA, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy in the US Department of Transportation. Welcome. Likewise, very delighted to have Nathalie Morin, Director General of Environmental Policies of Transport Canada here today. And also very pleased to have Juman KUBBA, a COP27 implementation lead and strategic researcher from the International Transport Workers Federation, the other ITF, as we call each others as well. Very much welcome. Today we were looking at two sessions of 90 minutes each, and we very much look forward to have a very productive discussion on how we make sure that the transitioning into net zero transport is managed also in a way that is just transition. And this will be the focus of our session here as well right now. Let me first ask my colleague Elisabeth WINDISCH to give a scene-setting short presentation on the issue of just transition. Elisabeth is our co-lead of our Transport Research Center. So Elisabeth, over to you.
Thank you, Jari. So yeah, I just want to give a few opening words, a brain teaser basically about what we actually talk about when we talk about transport decarbonization and a just transition. So just to give you a bit of background, what the challenges actually are. So what's in store for the future of transport? We see that passenger and freight demand will keep growing. It will keep growing to double the size or even triple the size to 2050 compared to 2019 values that we see. This is due to economic growth and population growth. And we also see that current policy pathways do not align with the Paris Agreement goals. So the current policy pathways still see emissions continue to grow to 2050 by around 15%. So in a way, this is good news because given that we double or triple transport demand and we only see a 15% increase in emissions, we can see that there's a certain decoupling of economic growth and transport CO2 emissions. However, this growth is obviously not in line with Paris Agreement goals. We do see that if we had higher ambition and were on the path of the breakthrough goals that were defined at the UK COP presidency last year, that we could reduce transport emissions by 85%, and this would bring us very close to the Paris Agreement goals that were defined. So basically, hope is not lost, but there is a big gap. We also see this reflected in the international commitments. So we see in the nationally determined contributions that countries, yes, they acknowledge by now, basically all of them, that transport is an issue and transport has to be tackled. We also see that the majority of countries is willing to define a certain set of measures. However, very few countries, less than 20%, are really committed to this and have defined at an international level also CO2 reduction targets for transport. We know that in national plans, the picture is not as grim, and there's actually more countries that are willing to set out transport emission reduction targets, but they're less willing to actually commit to this on an international level. And this is what we have to work on. Now, what is the just transition challenge that comes with the decarbonization challenge? A just transition means that we have to ensure environmental sustainability as well as decent work, social inclusion, and poverty eradication in the whole process and achieve this by 2050. This will require new jobs, new industries, new skills, and new investments to get there. Now, what does this mean specifically for the transport sector? In the transport sector, we need to make sure that we have decent levels of accessibility to opportunities and goods for all, regardless of the income group, regardless of the age, location, or specific needs of any population group. And this requires, in transport specifically, investment in affordable, accessible, gender-sensitive, and safer streets, as well as places, mobility, and logistic systems. And having said all that, it obviously requires a very country-specific approach, as there are different starting points and the characteristics of each country are different. So I'm very happy today to hear from different representatives of different countries and organizations what their plans are and what they are doing in order to make sure that they meet these country-specific requirements to enable both a just transition and a transition to zero-carbon transport systems. And with this, I give it back to Jari to introduce the panel again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. And Elisabeth will stay here for any questions. We hope to have some time for questions after the panel introduction and panel discussions. Let me turn first to Nathalie, to Transport Canada. Canada has a very much people-focused approach for building transport policies. And I have to say, transport is not very represented at this COP. And I'm really pleased to have transport ministries and people from transport industry here today to talk about this. So, Nathalie, what are you doing to ensure just transition for zero-carbon transportation in Canada?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here today to discuss such an important matter. So transition to a net zero economy is the great challenge of this generation, yet the greatest opportunities. Canada is committed to this challenge with a people-focused approach, which involves ensuring no one is left behind at the national, but also at the international level. In Canada, we believe in the importance to consult Canadians, and it was what we did last year. So we wanted to hear from Canadians on what a just transition meant to them. We received over 30,000 submissions of feedback on what a just transition should look like. And with this feedback, we created the Just Transition Advisory Body to provide objective recommendations to the government on regional and sectorial strategies, because it's important to support the workers, but also the local communities. And it's clear that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach on this one. In Canada, we also think it's important to support the international community, and this is why we also signed at COP26 the Just Transition Declaration. But to give you a practical example, so for the zero-emission vehicles, a just transition for us meant, after consultation, the importance to provide incentive for Canadian and small, medium enterprises to access electric vehicles. But we also put a price cap to ensure that these incentives were not provided for luxury cars. But we also try to find a way to support all workers, but also everyone throughout the supply chain, to make sure that everyone was supported and could be moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to hear about this, really the strong stakeholder engagement that you have in Canada. That is something that we very much also propose our countries, member countries, to focus on, to get the people involved on the transition. I'll be coming back to you about the challenges of the work that you just mentioned there, but let me go to Andrew from the United States perspective. A country with large distances, long distances, how do you ensure just transition? What are the key concrete actions that you're taking in the United States at the moment?
Well, thanks so much for having me and for having this important panel. You know, a just transition from the United States' perspective and from the U.S. Department of Transportation's perspective in particular is to ensure that those folks that have traditionally been excluded from the transportation planning process are actually included going forward. It turns out that when the interstate system was constructed in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, it not only didn't include disadvantaged people, but sometimes it worsened their conditions. So going forward, the President of the United States, through executive order, one of the flagship executive orders, instituted what we're calling a Justice 40 policy. And that's to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits of our transportation investments for covered programs go to underserved and overburdened communities. So we're going through a process right now of measuring benefits, measuring burdens, because it happens to be the case that you can't just measure how much money you're providing to a particular community, right? Some communities in the past have been resourced, but they've been resourced in ways that widen highways, that displace communities. And so each program, we're going through a measurement process to actually measure what the benefits are, measure what the burdens are, and then assess those resources appropriately. You know, we are at an auspicious time in the United States. Today is the 1-year anniversary of one of the president's flagship climate change pieces of legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law. We had to start essentially from scratch in measuring benefits and burdens. So we have a long way to go, but the good news is, you know, one of those concrete examples, we have an electric vehicle charging infrastructure program, and we're going through the process of ensuring that at least 40% of benefits and burdens for that particular program and for programs across the U.S. Department of Transportation are inclusive of disadvantaged populations.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I really like the point that you're bringing, the fact about measurement and measuring the impacts and understanding the distributional impacts and effects of the policies that we put in place. Again, I will come back to you about the challenges of the work what you're doing. Let me turn to Juman KUBBA from the International Transport Workers Federation. We talk about people. I mean, workers are at the heart of this just transition as well. Yeah. Can you give an examples of your work on the just transition and the workers' perspective?
Of course, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here with all of you. So yes, I think we all know that when just transition was brought into the Paris Agreement, it was a just transition of the workforce. And that piece often gets forgotten. Often we actually don't bring the worker voices in, and it's really great to see how you're trying to do that. But for us, it's crucial that happens globally, that happens across the board. So for this COP, we've done some work bringing together learnings and experiences from workers across countries in Africa in a report we've just published, looking at exactly what those learnings are and what that means for a just transition. And just very briefly, I'll give 2 examples of that. So firstly, looking at the informal sector, as I think most people know, transport actually is relatively small. Transport emissions are very small in Africa at the moment, but that is set to increase substantially. Africa is moving very fast to urbanization. And as you see cities grow with 950 million people set to increase the number of city dwellers by 2050, that means the level of transport will increase massively. So investment in public transport is key to curbing emissions, but the problem with it is that that has implications for informal transport, which is what cities currently rely on. And so there's real questions there about what happens to the minibus drivers, the ticket sellers, the bicycle riders who are currently manning the streets. What happens to the disadvantaged groups, people like women, young workers who tend to be focused in informal transport? What happens to passengers? What happens to lower income people who tend to rely on informal transport? New formalized systems often have to be quite expensive in order to pay for the cost of them. And so that means you can find them, the people who most need transport, being pushed out. So all of those are things that need to be brought in. And so what we're trying to do is bring that in. And one of the ways we've been doing that is doing what we think government should be doing, which is doing labour impact assessments at the outset of new transportation projects and trying to bring those learnings in. So we've done that. We've shown it can be done. We've shown how that can be positive, how it can bring in learning, save costs, make it more efficient. But the problem is that we can't do it everywhere. It's not our job. So we want governments to do that. We want that to be part of the norm. And then very quickly, the other area we've been looking at is working conditions. So we know that you can see in Africa huge impacts from storms, from sea level rise, from higher temperatures, from sandstorms, and they have huge impacts on the daily working conditions of transport workers. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of action plans and a lot of financing makes no reference to transport when it comes to adaptation. And if there's no money and there's no thought in the plans, you aren't going to build resilience, you aren't going to have protection for working conditions as climate impacts increase. And so again, bringing those workers in, we've just done a big project in Cairo, bringing in their examples, and again, we want this to be something that governments take forward. We really welcomed the COP26 declaration, and we're happy that the US and Canada both signed up to it, so we're trying to kind of build on that as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juman, and it's actually an excellent segue to the discussions about Global South. We mentioned the informal public transport question, which is such a crucial point for the Global South as well. Unfortunately, Her Excellency ABOU-ZEID has not been able to join us yet, but we're very happy to have our Head of Transport and Mobility here, Eric. Could you tell us a little bit about what the African Union view is on how we should move forward with the just transition, and what are you doing in the organization on that topic?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here with this distinguished panelist, and on behalf of Dr. Amani ABOU-ZEID, the Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy. To answer this question, just wanted to first of all highlight that our role as African Union Commission as a kind of policy-making institution to work with the 55 member states. One of the first mandates we have is to, first of all, before we talk even to the transition, we have to develop our transport network, which is efficient, which can assist in terms of the trade development, the tourism, and also to remove a lot of existing, market gaps. So the second main objective is to also see other sectors in terms of the sectors which are supporting this network. How can we, create linkages to know exactly what are the potentials to develop this transport network? In terms of the transition, our main focus is two ways. One is developing the railway transport sector, because the railway transport sector is, less, pollutes, emits less emissions compared to the road transport. Currently, the continent of Africa relies 80% on the road transport. So our strategy has been now to look at the railway transport sector, try to develop it, not only for the long distances, but even for the accessibility in the urban areas, to be able to move and, develop. Currently, we have 12,000 of new railway lines. We have African Continental Railway Market network, which we are trying to develop, with 12,000 kilometers of new railway lines that we need to develop by 2040. And then we have another 17,000 of existing railway lines that have to be modernized. So this is one of the critical priority area we are seeing, because when you look at the railway, and we are promoting the standard gauge railway as one of the key, because it has other advantages in terms of the speed, in terms of the standards, in terms of electric components, in terms of reducing emissions. So that is the first strategy. The second strategy is in line with what was already said on public transport. Public transport and also accessibility, improving door-to-door mobility. Door-to-door mobility, like, before you go to the buses and the railway trains, you have to move people from their homes to the main station. And so trying to develop a multimodal transport system that will support public transport. Then after that, changing the mindset, because the main issue for Africa is a dramatic change in terms of the mindset, in terms of the policy, the design. Then after tackling the design, the policy issues, then we move towards to see what does it take now to have a well-developed public transport system. For example, issues of electric vehicles, issues of e-buses. These are already existing. Some countries are already developing. We are trying to assist those countries to develop more vehicles, but the major issue is to tackle the policy issues before we go to the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And really this point about, we're not talking about mobility at the end of the day when we talk about transportation. We're talking about access to opportunities. And the shift in our mindset from moving from mobility to accessibility, I think, is one of the key crucial points. Can I follow up on that? Just a very quick question on what do you think is the major challenge in the African context? What is the blocking for us to move forward? Is it financing? Is it, what is it?
So as I just said, the statistics show us that 80% of transport within Africa relies on road transport, which is associated with other issues on especially road safety. We have an African Road Safety Action Plan, which aims to reduce by 50% the road accidents by the year 2030. This is in line with the global road safety targets. So the first challenge is to reliance on road transport. The second challenge, even for the existing road transport system, we have old vehicles, we have imported cars, which are being put on the market in Africa. So these cars, when you look at the trend and the rates, even if we are promoting cleaner fuel vehicles, electrical vehicles, but the accessibility, the affordability to these electrical vehicles is still a challenge. So we need, as we are shifting on the policy level, we also need to look at the financial possibility. What are the key partners who can assist us in this journey to be able to move towards this transition in a more realistic way? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very good points. Following on that, maybe moving to Natalie in the context of Canada and Transport Canada, you spoke about making sure that we've switched to zero-emission vehicles. What are the major blocking things for you that you see in this transition, and what should happen and by whom for us to move forward?
So for zero-emission vehicles, one of the key challenges is still the price disparity between a combustion engine and with an electric version. So we are really hoping that the differences and discrepancy will be going down over time, but for that, the other key element is availability. And the other thing we want to make sure is that when there is a country that does put forward a mandate or regulation, you see that sometimes the supplies are directed towards these regional provinces or countries. So we want to make sure that these supply can be also provided to other countries where there's no regulations yet, to make sure that everyone can have access to these vehicles. So it's not easy right now with the supply chain issues, but we're really hopeful that as soon as this is resolved, availability will be more available to everyone, not just in regulated countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew, just sitting next to your neighboring country, Canada, are the challenges and the blocks that doesn't let you move forward fast enough the same in the United States, or are they different? And what, in your view, should be done for us to have a much more rapid action on the transition?
Yeah, so maybe just to build off of what Natalie was saying, I think in the United States we have a number of challenges, but also a number of opportunities. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act are going to give us more opportunity to create options, to reduce trips, to shift trips, to improve trips, and to negate emissions. We have more funding than we've ever had before to now improve active transportation for walking infrastructure, biking infrastructure. We probably don't talk enough about that as an international community. We should have those conversations more. In terms of shifting trips, we have the greatest investment of transit in our nation's history, the greatest investment of rail since the inception of Amtrak. We have $7.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure, but we also probably need to change the conversation about not only how much funding we have, but how we're going about using that funding to implement, Justice 40 and the just transition that you're speaking to. So I think performance metrics, as we've talked about, are a challenge, but something that we're working through with respect to definitional approaches of disadvantaged communities, what constitutes a disadvantaged community, what constitutes a benefit, what constitutes a burden. Obviously, funding remains a challenge, particularly for disadvantaged communities. I think capacity building is also something that we ought to be talking about. I think providing technical assistance is one thing, but as a resourced country, particularly with the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, one thing that we want to lift up at this COP is that we have new resources to be able to scale the investments that we've legislated through bill and through the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate piece of legislation that's passed. So now through an initiative called Prepare, we're able to provide toolkits for adaptation, for resilience best practices. We're also able to integrate learnings from other countries. You know, we don't have the best practices across the board, so we want to integrate best practices where it makes sense, so that we can improve our adaptation and our resilience outcomes. We have another tool called Momentum, where we're able to socialize toolkits across countries. So we're looking to scale those toolkits and best practices in ways that that can integrate the funding that we've received from both pieces of legislation that we feel are once in a generation investments that we want to leverage appropriately.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I actually appreciate a lot for you bringing the walking and cycling into this discussion. I fully agree that that's an issue that we don't talk enough. I think we tend to forget the active mobility is at the heart of what we need to be moving forward with. Juman, you mentioned a point about sort of workforce is kind of the forgotten part of the puzzle. So what needs to happen for the workforce to be actually acknowledged?
I think firstly we need to acknowledge across the board that the workforce is a key part, that has to be the standard, and it's not the case at the moment. So we did an analysis of 60 NDCs representing 93% of GDP globally. Less than 10% referenced a just transition for the workforce. When we've all been to them, right? All this week we've been to climate finance negotiations, we've seen the drafts. They don't reference just transition for the workforce. It's just missing. And if it's not in there, you're not going to get the benefit of the inputs that workers have. They won't be able to feed into plans. They won't be able to tell you what training they need in order to be part of the new process. So they really need to be part of it, and that has to be a real focus. So that's something we're really pushing for. Critically, we all know that nothing can happen without the financing. And so the workers' voice has to be represented in financing. There have to be benchmarks, there have to be provisions within financing, text and agreement that require things like assessments, require social dialogue with trade unions and workers, or it won't happen. And if it doesn't happen, we all lose out. On the flip side, the benefits are really positive. So we've done some work looking at what you could do if you did public transport well. So we did some modelling looking at 5 cities and looked at what it would look like if we got really good public transport that works for workers and is in line with keeping 1.5 alive. We found that looking at Milan, London, Johannesburg, Jakarta, Houston, investment in public transport in just those 5 cities would generate 650,000 new direct jobs, and indirect and inferred jobs, another 650,000 globally. That's a huge number, and that's something I think we all want to see, good jobs, training for them, but you need workers in to sort of make sure that happens well.
Excellent, thank you very much. I have to say that I asked the panel to be short and brief in their intervention. I have to applaud and thank you very much for that, because this does allow us to also turn to you as an audience for any questions or comments you may have for the panelists as well. Our colleagues from ICCT might have some microphones available there. That please raise your hand if you'd like to have a question or comment. Here in the front, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lennart Naut. I'm here for the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, a network of cities and regions working together to a net zero transport sector in 2050. I'm really glad to hear the comment about walking and cycling, because I do think if we're talking investment into a just transition, right, the definition was very clear. Accessibility of that transport is super important, and the low-hanging fruit is really in the walking and cycling. And my question then to the panel is, what can we do in terms of financing to make sure that also the Global South has access to not just resources to build cycleways, but also the knowledge and the capacity building that's required to make sure those networks work well, work for everybody, and make sure that we have the staff that's educated to deliver on those projects. Because financing is one, delivering, if you go from a 1% investment in sustainable transportation to a 10%, delivering the tenfold of projects is almost impossible, as we see in Ireland now or in other countries that have done that. So I'm wondering what can we do in terms of financing and capacity building to make that happen?
Eric, maybe from the Global South perspective, and maybe other panelists if you want to go for it.
I think the most important thing before we talk of financing is to make sure that these projects are planned. You know, the planning, the master planning is very critical. Before you talk of the, you know, packaging the projects, they have to be in an integrated, you know, kind of package that will attract any development partner. Because for me, I see the critical challenges on the planning stage. When you are designing any infrastructure and you are looking at the green infrastructure, when it's not done at the beginning, at the design stage, even bringing that project to bankability from, you know, the feasibility to bankability will be a challenge. So this is my take on it. The secondly, on the capacity building, I think the first thing is this is a very excellent opportunity. Actually, this event on itself is an opportunity, especially for us, Africa, to learn from these international institutions, you know, establish some networking and be able to understand even some of these capacity building programs. Capacity building program, I take it more on the side of exchanges of best practices, be able to network, be able to exchange information, be able to design practical design solutions that work in one continent and can work in another continent before we can even go to the actual training of professionals in this field. Thank you.
If anyone, Andrew, maybe you mentioned that.
Maybe just a very quick comment. You know, I think it's one thing to talk the talk. It's another thing to walk the talk. One thing that we've done as part of implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law is centered around transit-oriented development and transit. We've talked about walking and biking a little bit. We essentially have a financing bank housed within the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's called the Build America Bureau. And so what we've said for the first time ever is instead of 33% financing for transit projects and transit-oriented development projects, we're ratcheting that up to 49% funding. So if you have a transit-oriented development project, any TOD project, or any transit project, we're automatically increasing the financing capacity from 33% to 49%. That's in addition to all of the funding provisions that we have that are focused on transit, you know, active transportation. That's another tool in the toolkit to sort of grease the opportunity to shift trips and to reduce trips and provide options to do so.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Natalie.
Maybe very just quickly on the capability sharing, I think it's super important to share knowledge, and I think we have seen like on the international organization, the ICAO for CORSIA, one of the key success for that initiative was also to be able to share between developed and CBDR countries the knowledge, and we have received a lot of good feedback. So I think it's something we need to build on for other transportation modes in the future.
Just to add to that, why is it so loud when I do it? Just to add to that, I think if you want to share knowledge, you need to have the knowledge. And one of the big issues in Africa and across the developing world is huge gaps in knowledge. Without that, you can't plan, you can't finance properly. And so you actually need financing to gather the information you need in the first place. And one example of that that's really quite telling is on adaptation and resilience. When we talk about transport, there's been a lot of focus on mitigation. Rightly, transport accounts for a lot of emissions. But transport sector, transport workers are also one of the most impacted by climate harms. And yet, transport is pretty much ignored when it comes to NDCs, when it comes to climate financing. It's just not part of the picture. In our analysis, we found that I think only one NDC even looked at transport properly within its adaptation. And that's a problem. You don't know what the issues are. And so the result of that is that you end up in situations where you're building projects, you're building new infrastructure, you're setting up new services in a way that doesn't account for new climate harms. It doesn't protect against further harms in the future. It increases loss and damage going forward. It doesn't build in ways that can mitigate, because good transport systems are really about mitigation. None of that's happening. And the result of that is really harmful for society, for our environment. It has harms on health, physical and mental, working conditions, as I said. You see results like forced migrations, etc. All of that is linked to this lack of knowledge. So we really need climate financing that tackles those gaps. And for us, the key part of that is bringing the people who are keeping transport systems going into the conversation and bringing funding into that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we have time at least for one more question. We have several questions. I think I saw the first one was the lady in the white shirt in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Grace Wolf. I'm here at the University of North Carolina. And I'm actually really interested in the investments going to the US and Canada. I worked last summer in public transit in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And one of the really interesting things about that is despite all the funding being placed into the city, it's really hard to get people who are used to having their cars at their fingertips to want to use this. So I'm just really curious how the US and Canada in particular are thinking about going about tackling the consumer side of wanting to use these new investments, even if your public transit's great and there's awesome, easy places to park and everyone has their own car. How are you going about thinking to get people to want to use these resources? And maybe it is a labor side, coinciding it with people's jobs so that it's easy for them. But I'm just really curious what ideas you have on that side of incentivizing people to want to shift to this maybe more green, conducive travel and transit.
Good question. In Canada, we did start with probing the system and providing incentive, but we did announce upcoming regulations. So there's a promise that was announced in the March that we will regulate zero emissions vehicles in Canada. So the regulations are in the works. They are going to come out soon. The ultimate goal is to have 20% of zero emission vehicles sold. That needs to be zero emissions vehicles in 2030 and 2025, and ratcheting it up all the way to 100% by 2035. So it's coming, and in Canada, because we have provinces we have two provinces that have already regulated, and we can see the huge difference and impact that this has on the sales. And the same announcement was made for medium and heavy duty trucks, which is also coming. Thank you.
Maybe it's such a great question. Maybe, the only other thing to add is in addition to all of the investments that we have in the bipartisan infrastructure law and in the Inflation Reduction Act to reduce trips, to create options to reduce trips, shift trips, improve trips, I think it's important to think about the values and vision associated with the transportation infrastructure investment. So with transit and rail, just like the highway system, we want to encourage transportation systems that are convenient, that are accessible, that are reliable, and that above all are equitable. Right? We want to make sure that people, if they're waiting for that transit connection, that they actually have access on a regular basis and that they know that that bus is coming, and the same thing with passenger rail as well. Too often in the United States, you have transit systems, rail systems that not only are inaccessible, but don't provide the kind of reliability or certainty that's necessary. And so one of the emphasis of the bipartisan infrastructure law is not necessarily just expanding capacity, it's to make sure that that existing capacity is provided in a way that provides certainty to folks who need it.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for, there was a gentleman over there with the hand up, was a microphone here. If I may ask a very, very short question, and from the panel, I'm sorry, I'd really love to continue, but we have another panel starting in 3 minutes, so we would like to give them the chance to speak as well. Thank you. It should be on. It should be on.
It's on? Okay. So thank you very much. My name is Roberto. I'm the founder of CPopulis. We are a data analysis company. We do mobility data analysis to measure the impact and to define strategies for decarbonization. My question is about public transport. When you talk about public transport, in my view, there are two competing goals in terms of investments. On the one hand, you want to expand your infrastructure to provide a reliable service and a better quality service for citizens. And on the other side, you want to also decarbonize the existing infrastructure and convert it to a non-carbon zero network. So what should we prioritize? What do you do? I mean, how do you manage their investment? What are you prioritizing? Do you want to expand your infrastructure or clean up the existing infrastructure? What should we do?
Very quick, short comments. Eric first, maybe. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. And then Natalie.
Yeah, for me, my answer will be simple. You just do it. If you do the public transport, you are doing both. You are tackling both. Of course, the longer impact will depend on the existing level of development of each, country, who is implementing this. Yeah, thank you.
Very quickly, I think it's important to do both. I think for the only reason that some of these modes take a lot of time with the turnover to change and see the impacts of new fleets. So in Canada, for example, we're really focusing on stimulating new purchases for zero-emission vehicles for medium and heavy-duty trucks, but at the same time, we are pushing the retrofits because we know these big trucks are on the road for a long time, so we need to stimulate both at the same time.
Just speaking to the global south, sorry, for some reason it hates me, I don't know why. Anyway, so just speaking to the global south, I think we need to recognize the reality we're in. There's a reason that informal transport is the prevalent means of transport in African cities, for example. It's because there's a gap. There's just not enough transport, public transport available. And if that's the case, what you're seeing is typically very polluting vehicles that have been got rid of, typically from North America and Europe, end up in Africa extremely polluting, and that's what's dominating the cities. And what you've actually seen from analysis, including by the IPCC, is that priority is expanding public transport. If we can also make it clean, let's do it. That depends on money. And that means we need to get money in to do it. But the priority has to be getting public transport in and having a just transition, which means bringing in informal workers so they're part of the process. There's an integrated approach. And that's what we need to see. And the other very last thing for me is just, I think we need to look beyond public transport. The issue of reliability you mentioned goes to everything. If you don't have reliable transport, good transport, invested in transport in the global south, that affects all of us. The supply chains in the north, for example, depend on things that come from the global south. If you don't have good transport routes, because you haven't invested in them properly, you haven't invested in resilience, that affects all of our supply chains. So it's in all of our benefits to get this right.
Thank you very much for being so quick, and I'm sorry, I do have to bring this to a close, this session. First of all, may I ask you all to join me to thanking the panel for their interventions and being so effective, so thank you very much. And before I hand over to our second part of the panel and the International Council on Clean Transportation and our colleague Priya Kumar to moderate the second session, let me just make a little link to the next session on aviation and just transition. So in the ITF, we've been working with the country-led stakeholder group, working on a policy vision on sustainable aviation fuels. How do we accelerate the application and scale up the SAF? This is just to give a heads up. If you're interested in this work, please do get in touch with us. But this will be something our colleague Dan Rutherford from the ICCT will talk about financing SAF as well in the next panel. So this is the bridge we're trying to make between the two panels, and I hope it worked very well. So thank you very much for all of you for being here, for the questions, and I'm sure the panel members, some of them are here, so if you have any further questions, please get in touch with them or us on anything. And Priya, please, I hand over to you for the next panel. Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and get started in just a moment, so if folks could take their seats, that would be great. Thank you. Hello and welcome to part 2 of our UNFCCC panel, A Mobility Just Transition, with a focus on the aviation sector. My name is Priya Kumar, and I'm a principal with Blue Crab Strategies, a climate-focused consulting firm headquartered in Washington, D.C., and I have the privilege of being your moderator on this afternoon's panel. I am joined by 6 esteemed speakers, 1 virtually and 5 in the room today, each of whom individually are experts in their field and together bring a deeply comprehensive perspective on what will be required to facilitate a just and equitable transition to zero-emission aviation. Before passing it over to our speakers, I want to address 2 pieces to lay the foundation for today. First, why this panel? Why now? In early October, ICAO adopted a 2050 net zero climate target for international effort of countless actors across the public and private sectors, as well as civil society. We first applaud this progress. And then, given the urgency of the moment, we quickly turn the page to ask, what's next? As aviation decarbonization moves from ambition to delivery, what must we prioritize, consider, and anticipate? The second piece to lay the foundation is, what do we hope to accomplish in the next 40 or so minutes together? What's next is a big question, one that we will seek to unpack. Delivering on this net zero ambition will require a rapid, rigorous, and coordinated international response. Our goal is to understand the role of each actor and how we can start to see this ecosystem as a puzzle, with each stakeholder complementing and elevating each other's efforts in pursuit of a shared ambition. And our challenge is not just to accomplish the goal, but to be intentional about how. While the aviation industry and its impact on climate are growing, flying activity is spread very unevenly across the global population, demanding that we approach this transition not just with an eye to equity, but with equity and justice at the core. With that, I will pass it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and answer a first rapid-fire question. In 1 word, what was your reaction to the ICAO 2050 net zero outcome, or the state of aviation decarbonization more broadly? We will begin with our first virtual panelist, Joe.
Hi, Priya. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Amazing. For once, virtual attendance works. Great. Hi, everyone. A pleasure to virtually be here. My name is Jo Dardenne. I am the aviation director at Transport and Environment. Transport and Environment is a European NGO and campaigning group that focuses on trying to make transport more sustainable, including aviation, as we know, one of the fastest growing source of CO2 emissions before COVID from transport. When it comes to your questions, your 5 questions, Priya, on progress to decarbonize, I think we're late. We're very late. And I would say close to being too late. And that's why my first reaction in 1 word to ICAO's long-term aspirational goal was, it's empty, it's embarrassing, because it provides no implementation plan when we actually desperately need it. It's a deal, it's a goal, great, but it has no teeth. So I think hopefully we can discuss, as you mentioned in this panel, what we can do to actually get that objective and translate it into reality.
Great, we'll continue next with Akash.
Thank you. Firstly, I'm both glad and grateful to be here. My thanks to ICCT for having me here. My name is Akash GOENKA. I'm with Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy, AEEE, and my core work is in data analytics and modeling and low climate impact cooling. But I had the happy opportunity to take a detour from my core work to lead a study on the impact of long-term aspirational goals on the Indian aviation sector. In response to the rapid fire, I want to say forward-looking, but for the time being, I'll just stick with well-meaning. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah COLENBRANDER, and I lead the climate team at ODI, formerly known as the Overseas Development Institute. My word is inadequate, but I think Jo had a bunch of brilliant words, so I'm just going to piggyback on her.
Hi everyone, my name is Silke MOOLDIJK. I work at New Climate Institute, a think tank and research institute in Germany, and one of the organizations behind the Climate Action Tracker. And I'm leading the Climate Action Tracker's assessment of the aviation sector. And in addition to that, I also assess airlines and airports' net zero pledges. And my reaction to ICAO's net zero target is big words, but little action.
Hi everyone, my name is Jeremy Anderson and I lead the Sustainable Transport Program at the International Transport Workers Federation, the other ITF. And our program develops and puts into practice just transition plans for each and every transport sector, currently with a major focus on aviation. In fact, just today, we are launching our ITF Sustainable Aviation Policy. In terms of the LTAG, in one word, speculative. We welcome the ambition, but we have big concerns about relying on unproven mechanisms, whether that is offsetting or unproven technologies to justify future growth.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Rutherford. I'm the Aviation and Shipping Director at the International Council on Clean Transportation. ICCT is a research-based nonprofit that advises governments worldwide on how to set better emission standards for all modes of transport. ICCT is also one of the co-sponsors of this event today. Our bread and butter is very much working on technologies to decarbonize the transport sector and the policies that are needed to promote them. But we have also started to think a little bit about how to implement a 2050 net zero target, and specifically released a report on climate finance for aviation that Jari mentioned earlier. So I'll focus my remarks on that today. But regarding my reaction to the ICAO 2050 net zero decision, my one word is relief. I'm glad we got it done. The question is where we go from here.
Great, thank you everybody. I appreciate the mix of hot takes and optimism. Look forward to getting more details on that in the next part of our discussion. Moving into the core questions for discussion today, the two key questions we'd love to get the panel's opinion on is, one, what does a just transition in aviation mean to you? I think just transition is this concept and this verbiage that's thrown around quite a lot, and I think you speak to different people and you hear very different perspectives on what that actually means and how we translate that into behavior. So that's question one. And then question two, getting into some more specifics, is what should be highest priority for both policymakers and the private sector in the next 1 year coming out of the ICAO target? We will begin again with our virtual panelist, Jo.
Thanks, Priya. Very important questions to answer, which I hope we'll try and answer as best we can in the next 30 minutes. But no, I think fundamentally, when it comes to aviation, we're at the make or break decades. It's socially and politically unfair for a sector like aviation to continue growing its emissions when other sectors are going towards decarbonizing, be it road transport, the industry, energy. And so now is the time to actually act. And the sector has been under-regulated when it comes to its climate impact for also decades. and overly subsidized. We've been subsidizing in a sector, a polluting mode of transport. So now we're realizing actually, well, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. And now we need to focus on a proper industrial policy to implement, the shift that we need. So taking, of course, workers as part of the transition and aviation workforce, because that's not going to happen without them. But there are immense possibilities, employment-wise, with all of the technologies that can be used to decarbonize aviation. And we can talk about a few, but sustainable aviation fuels is one of them. I think in terms of my number one priority for policymakers and the private sector, if we start with the policymakers, I think we have a great example in Europe for the past year. The decision makers have put on the table a climate package called the Fit for 55 package. Now, it could be improved, but it is one of its kind, especially when it comes to aviation. It was, one of the first, let's say, worldwide proposal to mandate the use of SAF in Europe. Putting a certain percentage of SAF gradually increasing over time. That's a way to decarbonize flights, and that was actually, we hope, quite effective. Now we have to make sure we use the right SAF and not create more problems by using SAF that is actually not sustainable. But that goes hand in hand with the proposals to get rid of some unfair subsidies, unfair fossil subsidies. Kerosene isn't taxed in Europe. Aviation received a lot of unfair subsidies under carbon pricing mechanisms. So this Fit for 55 tries to eliminate that. Of course, it needs to be improved, but I think this is the basis for further scale up. And then final point on my message and to the private sector is, let's not forget that aviation is going to be reliant, 99% in the next decade on fossil fuel. And that's why we need to talk about also managing demand and not coming back to the same levels of exponential pre-COVID growth that we've seen. We need to make sure that the private sector actually takes the lead in reducing corporate travel, for example, not just for the sake of the climate, but also for the sake of their pockets. Investors need to prioritize long-term solutions like synthetic fuels, and not just continuously expanding airports, continuously trying to grow at no cost, because actually there is a cost, and the cost is the climate.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing your thoughts, and thanks, Priya, for the question. In response to the first question, which is about what I think about just transition in aviation, just a little bit of background. The penetration of aviation in India, measured in terms of RPK, or revenue passenger kilometers, and the number of departures per capita, is very low compared to what we see in the developed world, countries such as the US, the UK, and Australia, and even in other developing countries such as Indonesia and China and Brazil. In other words, whilst the aviation sector or market has matured in the developed world, it is still growing in developing countries, with the promise of a multiplier effect on economic growth and employment generation. In my mind, a just transition in aviation should respect developing countries' growth priorities within the framework of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, whilst setting differentiated targets for developed countries and developing countries, and making access available to an aviation-specific multilateral funding to at least kickstart, if not sustain, the deep decarbonization of the aviation sector. So that's my response to the first question. In response to the second question on the specifics, in my mind, for the private sector, the work should be in a context of the recent negotiations at the 41st ICAO's assembly, wherein we saw a paradigm shift from emissions offsetting to emissions reduction, and this is a welcome shift. However, based on my understanding, there is very little clarity on the commercial viability of emission reduction measures, particularly of the type of technology and sustainable aviation fuels, SAFs. In my mind, in the next 1 year, the private sector should conduct a rigorous techno-economic assessment of short-term and medium-term interventions needed for decarbonization, whilst also taking stock of their current and planned industry capabilities. And this should be done in an integrated approach that brings together aircraft manufacturers, fuel suppliers, airport sort of managers, and airlines. So that's for the private sector. For policymakers, it should happen at 2 levels. At the international level, now that we have this sort of North Star, or well, South Star, well, of 2050, net zero by 2050, policymakers should negotiate short, medium, and long-term, as well as mandatory and voluntary targets differentiated between developed countries and developing countries within the context of a just transition, as I described it previously. At their own country level, policymakers should harmonize existing sustainable aviation policies, and I can't overstress the importance of consolidating fragmented policies into a cohesive net zero aviation plan for their country, or an NZAP, which will help signal strong political intent and galvanize international funding, both in private sector as well as public sector investments, technology transfer, and capacity building into their countries. Thanks.
Fortuitously, you've covered some of the ground that I was hoping to do, so let me see what I can do to piggyback on this. So, as well as Joe's comments, I'm really free riding on the rest of the panel here. So the first thing to say is that I'm not a transport expert, unlike pretty much everyone else on the stage. I'm here today because my colleagues at ODI, who've been working on something called the Airport Tracker, done in partnership with ICCT and T&E, couldn't be here in the second week. And I'm, as much as I love my colleagues, I was really delighted that they couldn't be here because it gave me a chance to have a look at some of the numbers in the Airport Tracker, and they are appalling. Let me just give you a few of the really shocking statistics. So 62% of passenger aviation emissions were created in high-income countries. For context, that's where about 15% of the world's population lives. So they have an outsized carbon footprint, about 4-fold in the aviation sector. A further 28% of aviation passenger emissions can be attributed to upper middle-income countries. So we're talking 90% of aviation emissions coming from countries that account for less than half of the world's population. And within that, there's a few really striking examples. So, for example, given that airports are ultimately about bridging distance, let's put it in spatial terms. Latin America is twice the size of Europe, geographically, but air traffic in Europe is 4 times that of Latin America. And so what we're seeing is this story of really stark aviation inequality. And as a result of that, I think there are 3 key elements to a just aviation transmission in terms of tackling in particular airports and the critical role that they play in enabling people to travel by this mode. So the first part is straightforward, and it's something that the environmental community has really picked up on. We do not need airports to be expanded and built in high-income countries anymore. That is just not a good use of time and resources, and particularly considering what a high proportion of them are funded by public finance. That is not a good way to use taxpayer money for poverty or for climate. The second thing, which remains controversial in high and upper middle income countries, is that we do need to recognize that some low and lower middle income countries are going to need more airports. And the reason I say that is because we've seen what is happening in oil and gas, where there's a huge inequality and hypocrisy in the way that some northern countries are approaching the prospects for oil and gas in other countries, taking away international finance for fossil fuels without providing international finance for clean energy. And I think we need to be nuanced from the outset in the way that we approach aviation. That is not at all to argue that aviation should be the preferred mode of transport in low and lower middle income countries. It should absolutely not be. In countries like India, which are very high density, there's huge opportunities to expand rail. In countries like South Africa, which are overwhelmingly dominated by a few big cities that are not actually that far apart, it's just that South Africans currently like their cars, and I can say that because my parents are South African. But high-speed rail offers an obvious solution to connect Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban. but we need to accept that there will be opportunities or reasons for some airport expansion in low-income countries. And the real piece that I think links this together in terms of a just airport transition or a just aviation transmission is the very, very urgent need for a rapid expansion of affordable, comfortable, low-carbon alternatives, especially high-speed rail. And I think, as I offered the examples in India and South Africa before, there are fantastic examples of this emerging all over the world. In the EU, billions of dollars are currently being poured into the new Trans-European Transport Network, which will slash travel times between places as far apart as Copenhagen and Hamburg, or Bucharest and Budapest. But actually the real leader in this space is China. And that's often an unpopular opinion at the COPs, to say that China is showing real leadership in this space. Particularly we saw at COP26 some of the politics around this. But China accounts domestically for 2/3 of high-speed rail within its own country. It's also one of the major international financiers of new rail links, whether you're talking about connecting Kenya and Uganda, or you're talking about connecting Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, and Singapore. And that's an area where I think much more international development and climate finance needs to flow if we're to enable countries at all levels of income to be able to move off polluting aviation and inequitable aviation options to cleaner, more affordable transport that can really connect cities of all sizes. Love to hear your questions and feedback.
Thank you. I think some of the points I will mention build up on what you just said, Sarah, and also on Joe's points. So at the Climate Action Tracker, we calculated what ICAO's net zero pledge means for global warming, and we found that it is consistent with global warming of more than 3 degrees Celsius, so critically insufficient. And ICAO's net zero pledge and also all the net zero pledges put forward by individual airlines, I think just distract from the fact that there is no prospect for real decarbonization in the sector in the next 10-15 years. While sustainable aviation fuels can decarbonize the sector in theory, I think the problem is that we don't have enough renewable energy, we don't have enough biofuel crops to keep up with increasing demand in the sector. And then Sarah already mentioned that a small share of the global population flies, and when we look at international aviation, so long distances, it's just 1% of the population, 1%, that is responsible for over half of international aviation emissions. And these are often people who fly multiple times a year. And I think if we speak about just transition, and also considering the fact that there are no technologies available at scale to decarbonize the sector, I think we need to focus on reducing demand and start with reducing demand of those people who now fly the most. So that's the wealthiest people in the wealthiest countries. Then the second question on what should be the priority for policymakers and for the private sector. For policymakers, I think it should be to ramp up regulation and to put a tax on kerosene. It may have made sense in the 1940s to not tax kerosene, but it just does not in this day and age. And it makes that sustainable alternatives such as trains are just way more expensive than flying. So I think we need regulation and taxation. When it comes to the private sector, I think it's really important that airlines in particular are honest about the climate impact of their business and don't sell flights as carbon neutral or climate friendly, because they are just not. I think it's also important that the aviation sector ramps up its investments in zero carbon technologies so that we can scale up sustainable aviation fuels. And that they also lobby for climate regulation in the aviation sector rather than against it, so that the ambitious actors, the ambitious airlines are not placed at an economic disadvantage compared to their less ambitious competitors. Thanks.
So, just transition and aviation. Well, what it means to us is the importance of workers. And workers are the big gap in all policy discussions around decarbonisation and aviation at the moment. And that's pretty disappointing because, as the Paris Agreement says, if there's one thing just transition should include, it's the workers' perspective. But what has really been missed here is the crucial role that workers have to play in the decarbonisation of the industry. So there are many examples of how aviation workers are already leading action to decarbonise the sector. I just want to give you a few. So air traffic control workers are really kind of pushing the discussion around kind of more efficient routing and, of course, around avoiding contrails, which account for around 50% of GHG emissions in the sector. Ground handling workers are campaigning for electrification of ground fleets, which, the current diesel operations are both a major risk to worker health and safety, to local communities, and of course are producing unnecessary emissions. And this year we saw the landmark clean energy agreement between unions and the employer at LAX. Pilots are really kind of pushing hard on decarbonisation. For example, they're campaigning to end the practice of economic fuel tankering, where totally needlessly planes are carrying around much more fuel just to save the airlines a bit of money. So aviation workers are already acting on climate change. The 9 million aviation workers around the world are the army of problem solvers that we need. And government and industry really need to listen to aviation workers. So what does this mean in terms of policy recommendations? So as I said earlier, we launched our Sustainable Aviation Policy today, which includes a number of policy recommendations, but I want to focus on the big idea. And that is to have a global just transition task force for the aviation sector, bringing together the key employer groups, the key UN agencies, and of course, the ITF represented aviation workers. Now we know this model can be very successful. We launched one for maritime at COP26 last year, and we're already showing the benefits in terms of the work we're doing around the skills that maritime workers will need. So the really pressing priority when it comes to what a task force would do on aviation, we see is an employment plan and a jobs plan. And we really need to shift the narrative here about climate change policy in aviation means job losses for workers. I don't think there's much evidence that that is going to be the case. What we do see is a great need for the skills that aviation workers have. Right at the moment, when the industry is facing the worst labour shortages it ever has, which is partly a result of the COVID crisis, but also a result of the race to the bottom in working conditions and labour standards that many parts of the industry have been pretty relentlessly prosecuting for the last 2 to 3 decades. So that needs to change. Employers and governments need to get around the table to plan what kind of future workforce the industry needs, what skills are needed, and make sure that we can attract a new generation of aviation workers who are ready to commit, of young workers, and also retain the key skills that we have in the industry. And these should be supported by a similar structure at national level. What we're calling for is national just transition committees, which I think speaks to what we had earlier about the importance of harmonising all the different initiatives. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. We've heard a number of really excellent definitions of just transition already. I will focus my remarks actually on the finance angle. So we've already heard several examples of the inequity of aviation emissions. We see that both at the level of countries and we see it at the level of individuals. So by one account, 1% of the world's population is responsible for half of the greenhouse gas emissions from flying. And I think we need to really take that into account when we design policies to push the sector towards net zero emissions. So my definition of a just transition is one where we can generate the revenue needed for a net zero target without further subsidizing frequent flying behavior, and without pricing out poorer consumers or countries from access to the aviation sector. According to an ICAO estimate, we'll need about $4 trillion through 2050 in order to implement a net zero target. And the majority of that investment will go to sustainable aviation fuels to replace fossil fuel. ICCT recently released a study looking at how you might finance that level of investment. We looked at a couple of different options, including a flat ticket tax that could be charged on a global basis. We also looked at a concept called a frequent flying levy, which in essence focuses as a progressive taxation for airline tickets. To give you an example, we could establish a system where the first flight that anyone takes in a year is untaxed. And from there, you get an increasing level of taxation. So, for example, the 6th flight you board in a given year, you would pay about a $45 tax. And we looked at that as a potential option to raise revenue to decarbonize aviation. And it turns out it's a really nifty way to shift the cost burden from not only from frequent flyers and from shift the burden to frequent flyers and to high-income countries. So concretely, a frequent flyer levy could collect 80% of its revenue globally from the 2% most frequent flyers, and collect about 70% of its revenue from high-income countries, therefore shifting the relative burden towards those who can afford the most to pay for it. I think that's my first recommendation for policymakers in the next year, is to think very carefully about the finance angle, and in particular, as Akash mentioned, options for international funding mechanisms to support decarbonization in the developing world. Private sector, I'll kind of shift gears here. I am an engineer by training, and a lot of my research has focused on aircraft and engines. If we look at the technology roadmaps that have been developed that point towards net zero aviation, about 60% of the expected mitigation will come from clean fuels, and about a third will come from fuel efficiency. And I really want to focus on what aircraft manufacturers need to be doing to support net zero emissions. Fuel efficiency is going to be important. Certifying planes to 100% sustainable aviation fuels are going to be important. And then developing new aircraft types, either those that are just generally more fuel efficient or completely new zero emission planes that can operate off of hydrogen or electricity. These will be important measures to take. Unfortunately, we're actually seeing, I won't call it backwards motion, but very little motion from the aircraft manufacturers right now. So I would like to see some declared targets and ambition, and in particular, to have Airbus and Boeing take a very close look at hydrogen designs.
Great, thank you all. Cognizant of time, unfortunately, it doesn't look like we'll have too much time for audience questions. The panelists will definitely be around after this session in case any folks want to take them aside and ask any follow-up questions. We will wrap up today with one final closing question for each of the panelists to follow up on a few of the thoughts each of you mentioned. So we'll start off with Joe. Joe, you offered a bit of a window into EU's leadership with Fit for 55. What is one lesson of experience that you would offer other countries also looking to tackle this aviation challenge?
That's a very good question, and I think there were very good points made by other panelists. I think when it comes to a lesson learned, I think governments need to think long term. Especially, the risk is that now we're all focusing on we quick need to find a quick fix to deal with aviation's emissions, and that has a tendency to go towards, let's say, the cheaper, less sustainable option. And I'm thinking here at different types of sustainable aviation fuels that aren't really clean, that aren't sustainable. They're made from crop-based biofuels that actually contribute to deforestation, and we don't want to create a new problem by trying to fix one. So thinking long term, making sure that there is scalable technology that is there, but you need to send the right incentives now. And this is my message, I think, in general, is this is the make or break decade. We can't lose another decade like the previous one, just waiting for industries to commit or waiting for the technologies to come. We need to set binding policies like the EU has done, mandating the use of clean fuels, effectively pricing emissions and kerosene. And that will make sure, hopefully, that in the 2030, 2035, we can actually have or start to have access to the right technologies to decarbonize aviation.
Thank you, Joe. Next, I'll pass it to Akash. Akash, you offered a bit of a different perspective from India's side on, this concept of common but differentiated responsibility and how we can start to manifest that through, differentiated country targets, funding flows. What is one lesson of experience that you would offer other countries from the India perspective looking to tackle this?
Thank you. I'll speak a little bit from my experience in my native work, which is in low climate impact cooling. And in 2019, India released the India Cooling Action Plan, which is the first for any large economy in the world. And it's had windfall gains both nationally as well as internationally. And more recently, it's become a touch point for South-South cooperation between India and other Southeast Asian countries, wherein they're adopting the model of the India Cooling Action Plan to develop their own country-level cooling action plans. I feel that in the same way, countries will benefit from creating national net zero aviation action plans, or NZAPs, which should be under the aegis of ICAO's negotiations at the 41st Assembly, and it should be housed with one nodal entity, primarily the Ministry of Civil Aviation, but also that it should have equal buy-in from the public sector, from the private sector, and from the knowledge sector, the likes of ICCT and others. I feel that this will signal strong political will and help countries garner the support which is needed for a just and accelerated transition to decarbonize aviation. Thanks.
Thank you. We are running up on time, so Sarah and Silke, maybe in 30 seconds or less, what is one don't that you would offer others looking to facilitate a just and equitable transition?
Given time constraints, I'm not going to answer your question at all very rudely. And actually just say to Dan how much I like the idea of your frequent flyer levy and the nuance that you brought to it. I would add that it would be fantastic to see if you could layer in something there about whether people are traveling economy, business class, first class or private plane, because I think that's a further way to layer up on the inequality element. And if anyone wants to hear an answer to your question, I will be here afterwards.
Yeah, for me it would be to focus on real emission reductions, and one clear don't is don't use offsetting, because it's not an equivalent to those real emission reductions, and it simply distracts from the fact that the aviation sector is extremely polluting.
Thank you. And to end on a forward-looking note for Jeremy and Dan, what is one half-crazy, counterintuitive prediction that you have for the next 5 years in aviation decarbonization?
So very quickly, you can see a scenario where airports grasp the nettle of decarbonisation around electrification, becoming solar energy producers in their own right, and go a long way ahead of the airlines and the rest of the industry, that they effectively, the industry can't keep up and airports have to be used for other things. And I think that scenario is really a warning, like Dan was saying, that the rest of the industry really needs to invest very heavily in alternative decarbonisation methods such as hydrogen.
All right. So my crazy prediction is that hydro-treated jet fuel becomes the e-bikes of aviation. And let me explain that a little bit. Electric vehicles are making great progress around the world, electric cars, but we're finding that they're remaining expensive and and have too much capability for many consumers. So we're seeing e-bikes, which is a really clever way to use an electric motor to generate torque for bicycles, become increasingly popular. I think there's an analogy in the aviation space. Sustainable aviation fuels are coming. They're scaling slowly, but they remain very expensive. One of the benefits of sustainable aviation fuels is they are low aromatics content, and therefore they can help abate the contrails that you see in the sky that have a warming impact. However, you can hydrotreat fossil jet fuel, remove that aromatic content, and also get the same aromatic contrail benefits. It's not well known, but in the same way that an e-bike is sort of a very practical, cheaper way to get the benefits of electrification, I think we can see the same effect coming from aviation just by hydrotreating fossil jet fuel.
We will have the audience keep Jeremy and Dan honest at COP32 to see if we landed anywhere near these predictions. In closing, I want to just say, at the start of this panel, I posed a question: what's next? My hope is that this conversation has sparked ideas in each of you of the role of your government, your corporate team, your family, and even you as an individual have to play in this fight. With the adoption of the ICAO target, the momentum is there, and the moment for action is now. For anyone interested, there is a follow-on EU virtual side event that Dan is also helping organize this evening in the EU Pavilion that will focus on government's role in facilitating a 2050 net zero target. And just in closing, a very, very sincere thank you to ICCT and to ITF for organizing this conversation, for each of our panelists for such robust perspectives, and to our audience for making time for this discussion amidst a very wildly busy calendar this week. I hope everyone has a very productive and fruitful remainder of COP. Thank you.